and welcome to LigNet. I'm John Bachman. Joining me right now on the phone from Washington is Ambassador Otto Reich. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela, as well as a senior administration official during the presidencies of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush as well. Ambassador, it's always good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
All right, so I want to start talking about things in Venezuela, what's going on right now. We've talked in the past about new President Nicolas Maduro and his inability to really lead the country. He's been criticized by others as well. How is Maduro doing? Is he getting a better handle on things in Venezuela? And if so, is that good or bad for relations with the United States?
Well, in a nutshell, Maduro could not be doing much worse, frankly. The economy is in terrible condition. They're running out of money. I know that sounds like a very broad statement, but they're very short of cash. Maduro went to China last month to try to borrow money. The Chinese extended another line of credit, but it's directly based or linked to investments in Venezuelan commodities like oil or minerals. And it's not cash, so he came back empty-handed from that trip. They have huge inflation. Inflation is close to 50% per annum now, so you can imagine the impact of that on the average consumer. Venezuela's oil production keeps dropping. It just nothing is going well for them, and it's simply based on one thing: is that they're following a failed economic practice, which is communism, Marxism, socialism, whatever you want to call it.
And, you know, Maduro initially suggested that he'd like to warm things up with the United States, but he's backed off of that. What is the real agenda right now with Maduro, considering he's in dire straits and might need some good relations from Washington? Well,
there's no question that they would like to have the relationship with the United States that would enable them to stay in power, reduce the friction, reduce the level of criticism, and increase their ability to borrow, because they're not producing enough. I mean, it's all driven by economics. The ideology is even secondary. It's hard for Americans to understand, and I've said this before on Newsmax, I've said it in other news organizations. It's hard for Americans to understand that countries like Venezuela and a few others around the world are run basically by an organized crime enterprise. These are people who stay in power with a facade of an ideology, but in effect, what they're doing is looting their countries. They're taking as much money as they possibly can. Scores of Venezuelan government officials, ministers, generals, bankers, people who do business with them, have become billionaires with a B. And this is what keeps them in power. And the ideology is just a tool that they use to try to portray an image that they're do-gooders. You know, that they're interested in helping the population. If they really were interested in helping the population, they would change their economic policies to the model that works, which is democratic capitalism.
Well, so Maduro is obviously in trouble, and he's in a survival mode at this point, as well as the other disciples of Hugo Chavez. We have not heard much about Enrique Capriles lately. What's he up to?
Enrique Capriles, the opposition leader who ran against Maduro in April, and in the opinion of a lot of observers, actually had the election stolen from him, is still the leader of the opposition. But because Venezuela is not a functioning democracy, even though it was supposed to be an elected government, it doesn't have freedom of the press. And there's very few outlets, free press outlets, that the opposition has access to. So you don't hear much about Capriles because he can't make his voice heard. The government has literally run out of business, put out of business, all of the major news organizations, the television networks, and a lot of the radios. They're intimidating or censoring the written press, which also censors itself. They're afraid they're going to be put out of business also. So they go out of their way to deny a platform to the opposition. That's why we don't hear very much about Capriles, but he's still around trying to do as much as he can to rally the opposition against Maduro and prevent the socialist government from perpetuating itself in power.
So Capriles is still there, still potentially a factor in all this. I want to also take a look in more general terms at the rest of South America. There's this potentially pivotal election about to take place in Honduras, but there's also the seemingly worsening relationships between both Argentina and Brazil in the United States. Let's start with Argentina, where President Cristina Kirchner recently had brain surgery, but she is also pressuring the nation's Supreme Court to quiet Argentina's free press. You just talked about this in Venezuela. Will Kirchner's plan work? Is she taking those same steps to make Argentina more like Venezuela in terms of a lack of free press there?
Well, there's no question that Cristina Kirchner and her late husband before her, Nestor Kirchner, who was president of Argentina from 2003 until 2008, are engaged in a campaign to establish another facade of a democracy. The Kirchners, Morales in Bolivia, Correa in Ecuador, Ortega in Nicaragua, certainly Chavez, Maduro in Venezuela, represent a new ideology that they themselves call 21st century socialism, which use the institutions of a democracy, starting with the election, to get into power. Then they change the rules of the game and to make sure that nobody ever replaces them in power. And that's why you have the Kirchners, who have been in power in Argentina since 2003, and who a lot of useful idiots, frankly, in the United States and other countries say are Democrats because they were once elected democratically. But what they do is exactly what you just described. They put they put pressure on the judiciary to rule in the way that they want. They pack the Supreme Court, as they have done, for example, in Argentina and in Ecuador and in Venezuela and in every other case. They harass, intimidate, or bankrupt the media so that there are no voices, so no voices of opposition can be heard. And then all of this so they can become multi-billionaires, and they drive the private sector of the countries out of business. And this is the result. This is why you see countries like Argentina and Venezuela and others that are extremely wealthy countries that should be very prosperous, going practically into bankruptcy.
Yeah, Argentina is a similar country to Venezuela in terms of what you're talking about with this new 21st century socialism, but also a much different country considering everything that Argentina's been through in the past quarter century. Is democracy really weakened to a point where Kirchner can utilize that and really have success with her goals?
Well, the history of Argentina is actually very sad, and it's not just the last quarter century where they suffered dictatorships and populist governments. You can go back 50 years to the Perón administration or maladministration. You can go back 100 years. 100 years ago, Argentina had the 5th largest gross domestic product in the world. That's a fancy economic term for per capita income. Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, and because of the selfishness of its political class and the fact that they followed bad economic policies, not in every one of those 100 years, but in most of them, they elected demagogues like Juan Perón and Eva Perón and Nestor Kirchner and now Cristina Kirchner, and people like that, others whose names we don't even remember, have either stolen the wealth of the country, literally stolen it, or have imposed policies that have driven the private sector out of business and have impoverished a country that 100 years ago was an extremely wealthy country.
Well, she clearly still has command of the country in terms of power with her presidency as well. I also want to move on, Ambassador, and talk about Brazil as well while we have you here. And President Dilma Rousseff recently canceled a visit to the White House in the wake of the NSA leaks becoming public. She didn't think it was right for Washington to be listening in on her conversations, but she's also faced some serious problems at home this past summer with riots in the streets. But she seemed to weather that, and she's also now predicted to win re-election next year. If she does win, what does the future hold for Brazil?
Well, we don't know. Again, Brazil is one of those countries that, as the Brazilians themselves referred to it jokingly, they said, Brazil is the country of tomorrow and always will be. And the reason they say that is because Brazil has so many natural resources, and such a huge country. Is literally larger in geography than the United States. It's larger in geographic area than the United States, than the United States without Alaska. It's a huge continent, and it produces practically everything very efficiently. Brazil should be one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And unfortunately, similarly to Argentina or to the other countries in Latin America, it has suffered this cycle of military governments, bad civilian governments, corrupt officials, politicians, that are interested only in their own self-aggrandizement, and it hasn't developed to the extent that it should. Now, in the last 20, 30 years, things appear to have been improving to the point where the rest of the world looked at Brazil in the last few years as a success story, and it looked like they were finally going to get out of that cycle of boom and bust. But because Dilma Rousseff, the current president, and her predecessor, Lula da Silva, are both quite center-left, they have followed policies that were not as bad as people had expected, since at one point they were both Marxists and ascribed to policies that we know never work. They did allow the private sector to do the job, to produce and allocate resources, but they cannot bring themselves to really unleash the power of the free market. They have fallen under the advice, or they listen to advice from a bunch of left-wing academics and ideologues that tell them that it's bad to have all of this wealth in the hands of the private sector. What they don't say is that, as we see in the case of Venezuela and Cuba and other places run by communists, that the wealth ends up in the hands of the people in power, to the detriment of the vast majority of the population in those socialist societies. So what happens if Dilma Rousseff is reelected? It depends on what she decides to do. She must know, she's a smart person, she must know what policies work, and that's the free market. She must look at countries like South Korea, a country with absolutely no resources, no natural resources, certainly not in comparison to Brazil, but a country that is, in the case of South Korea, competing with the United States in computers, automobiles, telephones, appliances, everything you can think of, because they have unleashed the magic of the marketplace. That's what Latin America should be looking to, and not failed models like Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela.
Well, the nation of Brazil will certainly be on display this next coming year with the World Cup and Olympics both headed there, so we'll see what happens with that. I also want to shift our attention to Mexico now, and President Nieto came into power with high expectations, but over the last several months his popularity has dropped somewhat, and he's facing pushback on some of the reforms that he pushed while he was a candidate, including energy reform. Is Nieto's window closing to pass those major reforms he championed while he was a candidate and right after he got elected?
No, I think it's too early to say, frankly, in my opinion, that the window is closing. I mean, Nieto's still in his first year. I think he's undertaken a lot of very positive reforms. He has attacked some of the institutions that were the corrupt institutions that were considered so powerful that some of his predecessors did not even try to deal with them, such as, for example, the National Teachers Union, which, by the way, should be a lesson for the United States. The Teachers Union was almost untouchable. They had presided over the decline of the Mexican educational system. Mexico was producing graduates that were completely uneducated, and many, from the public schools, which of course led to the creation of a lot of private schools because people want to have a better future for their children. And Peña Nieto finally dealt with it by jailing the head of the Teachers Union, a woman who was terribly corrupt and had amassed a fortune, instead of paying attention to the educational system that she was supposed to have been protecting. That's one example. Another is Peña Nieto. And by the way, all of these reforms are going to elicit a reaction, a negative reaction from people who are losing political or economic power. So there shouldn't be a surprise why Peña Nieto is running into difficulties, because he's dealing with some very powerful entrenched interests.
And one of those, Ambassador, is the drug cartels, and that has been one of the biggest issues for Mexico and for border states on the southwestern United States, quite frankly, where violence is still a problem there. Nieto has tried to chart a new path with drug cartels and violence. Is that strategy working?
It is working to the extent that the level of violence is lower than it was under the Calderón administration. Now, what we don't know yet is whether a price is being paid for this apparent pacification. We don't know whether there are some secret deals being made with some of the organized crime. I don't mean necessarily the government. It could be the state governments in Mexico. But the Peña Nieto administration has undertaken a different approach, not so much a confrontational approach with military forces against against organized crime, but more of judicial reform and court reform, prison reform, and other measures designed to make the justice system work. The justice system, unfortunately, wasn't working very well because the narco traffickers are so wealthy that they bought off the police, the courts, a lot of the politicians, and they would make them an offer they couldn't refuse. Either they accepted the money that the narcos were willing to offer, or they were killed, literally. So obviously the strategy had to be modified, had to be calibrated, and I think that it's too early again to tell whether the Peña Nieto strategy is going to work in the long run.
With everything going on in the Middle East and North Africa, it's easy to lose sight and lose focus of the important issues that are playing out every day in South America and Central America as well. But that's why we bring you in, Ambassador, to give us an update on all that stuff. We want to thank you very much for being with us. It's a pleasure speaking with you, sir.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us at LIGNET.